The banners of Winterfell hung limp in the cold air, their direwolf sigils white as bone against stone darkened by the creeping shadow of evening. Jon Snow stood beneath them and watched the king come to the north. He watched from the parapet over the main yard, where snow had gathered in the crenels like pale bread baked and forgotten. The sound traveled up to him, the creak of harness and the rumble of heavy wheels used to softer roads, the jingle of bright southern metal against studded leather and fur. He smelled horses and wet wool and, beneath it, the faint sweetness of spiced wine that clung to the king's train like an invisible standard. Below, the portcullis lifted, and the stark men-at-arms, in cloaks as gray as wolf fur, opened the gate to King Robert Baratheon and his fine entourage. The king rode a massive courser that tossed its black mane and bit on its bit. Robert himself wore fur over crimson velvet, an antlered crown glinting beneath the gray sky as if it remembered southern suns. His laugh carried up through the wind, big, bawdy, careless. It filled the yard and made the servants exchange glances, half awed, half amused. To his right, Queen Cersei Lannister sat her palfrey as if she weighed as much as a sigh. Her hair, fashioned into a shining aureole, looked too bright for the day. Behind her, Prince Joffrey gilded himself with smiles. He had his mother's golden head and the stiff, narrow set of her mouth. On the other side of the queen, a little girl in green trimmed with ermine rode with her back very straight, trying not to shiver, and beside her a plumper boy hunched within his mantle and snuck looks at everything. Myrcella, Jon thought, because he had learned all their names and faces as surely as any drill. Tommen, too. The last time a king had come to Winterfell, a boy named Brandon had looked down from these walls. It had been a different king then, different wounds. The courtyard bowed and murmured. Lord Eddard Stark went forward, grave and lean in his black wool, to meet his oldest friend. When they embraced, the king lifted Ned off his feet as if the north were not heavy with oaths and history. Laughter like thunder, a deeper quiet beneath. Jon kept his place, not too close, not too far. He stood where a bastard belonged, above some, beneath others, within everyone's sight yet set a little apart by an inch invisible and unbridgeable. Ghost pressed his white muzzle to Jon's hand, breath hot against cold knuckles, eyes red as banked embers. The direwolf watched, too, and was still. They will feast, Jon thought. They would fill the great hall's rafters with smoke and song and the long, familiar shadows that always came with a king's hunger. They would talk of old days and craft plans in laughter. Some of it would hold fast by morning. Much would become memory while the wine drained and the candles guttered. A trumpet sounded. Lord Stark and King Robert moved from mid-yard toward the steps. For just a heartbeat, the king's head tipped back and his gaze crossed the ramparts. He looked up, saw Jon, and watched him the way men look at storms gathering beyond hills. Then the glance was gone as quickly as breath on cold air, lost to the swirl of ceremony. Jon stood there a moment longer and told himself nothing had changed. He had learned to say those words so often that they felt like prayer. He turned and went down. The great hall of Winterfell remembered. Smoke from pitch torches wove old patterns. The stew of voices grew thick as the stew of venison, and the rushes bent beneath the tread of soldiers, courtiers, dogs, and children who darted like minnows among the guests. Ser Roderick's whiskers twitched at the heat. Septa Mordane fluttered near Sansa like a frilled hen. Arya scowled at the sleeves of the gown they had dragged her into. Robb made a good figure in stark gray, his smile easy, his blue eyes bright, and Bran climbed up on the bench and forgot to hide that he had done it. Jon took a cup from a servant and found the place reserved for those who were neither lord nor fool. Ghost settled beneath the bench, long and quiet, ears twitching at every bellow and scrape. From the high table, Robert's laugh kept returning like a thrown hammer. The queen's voice reached them sometimes, cool and cutting and forever polite. Joffrey whispered behind his hand, smirking with cleverness he thought invisible. And Myrcella? She looked excited and a little frightened, but not the kind of frightened that makes children cry, Jon thought. She watched everything with the soft, intent regard of a deer that has not yet learned men carry bows. When she smiled, it moved from face to face like a lantern's light. The first time Jon noticed her notice him, It was nothing. She glanced down the hall and her eyes fell on Ghost, whose fur seemed to drink the firelight and give back nothing. She leaned forward, said something to the boy beside her, Tommen, and the boy's small round mouth made a perfect O. Their mother's hand descended to their wrists without looking, guiding both back. Cersei did not speak. She did not have to. Later, when the wine had made Jon's blood warm and his troubles seem like stones far down in a stream, present unmovable but softened by the rush above, King Robert rose to his feet and raised his cup and told a story that made even Lord Stark's solemn mouth crimp. It was a story of a young giant and a tavern somewhere south of the Neck, and it was not fit for delicate company, but the Queen did not stop him. She smiled and smiled like a blade polished from both sides. When the laughter died, the king's gaze went again down the length of the room and climbed not to the banners or the rafters but to Ned. His expression altered. "We will talk," he said, not loudly, but Winterfell hushed around the words as if the old gods paused their listening. "Old friends must. Tomorrow then." Ned inclined his head and drank. Jon felt the current shift. He could not have said how. A bastard learned tide and weather. He knew when boats would drift and when they would be thrown against unseen rock. That night's sleep did not find him quickly. Benjen Stark had teased him at the feast. "You still mean to put on black?" And Jon had said yes with the simple, certain force of the word when it belongs to the young who have not had it broken. Ghost lay heavy and warm by the bed. Through the arrow slit, stars looked like a scatter of salt across slate. Jon thought of walls made of ice and of a place where a man's name drowned in oaths larger than any house. He thought of a life that made sense because it was small. No wives, no sons, nothing to remind him of what he was not. He did not think of the king again until morning dragged him into the yard where frost turned straw to glass. There was the stink of boiled oats and horses, of iron and leather. Men-at-arms practiced cut and parry in a sharp ring of steel. Robb and Theon Greyjoy hammered at each other with blunted swords, and the smile on Theon's lips made Jon's hands itch. Ser Jaime Lannister, fair as a lion in snow, watched as if hunting were happening before him and he was not in the mood to join. The hound's hound face hid most of what he felt, which was useful, Jon supposed, if what he felt was mostly heat. Near the postern gate a little court had sprung up. The Queen with a dozen attendants, a pair of Kingsguard knights, and the royal children. Myrcella reached for her palfrey's nose. Tommen giggled when the horse's upper lip twitched over his palm. Joffrey held himself apart and looked out of the side of his golden eyes at everything that was not him as if it were a misbehaving servant. "Your wolf," said a voice near Jon's shoulder. He turned. Tyrion Lannister had appeared as if the stones of the yard had coughed him up. The imp wore a fur so fine it looked like smoke and boots that had never met Winterfell's mud until today. "I have never seen one so white." "He is his own color," Jon said. It was the kind of reply that made Theon roll his eyes and Ser Roderick rumble disapproval. Tyrion grinned. "Most men don't think to say that," the Lannister said cheerfully. He looked at Ghost a long moment, and Ghost looked back without blinking. "I hope the Queen likes him less than I do." He peered across the yard at Cersei, whose profile could have been cut with a small, exact knife. "It's good for the court to like different things. It gives us all the illusion of choice." Jon did not know what to say to that, so he said nothing. Tyrion seemed content with the silence. When he went away, he bowed from the waist as if addressing a king. Jon found he liked him and did not want to, which was confusing. He returned to the practiced swords and took up a blade and lost himself in the clang and the breath and the simple mercy of movement. By the time the sun found a dozen pale fireflies in the rim of the cloud, Lord Stark and King Robert had vanished into Winterfell's stone belly. They went together to the crypts. Jon knew this not because anyone told him, but because when old friends came to Winterfell their feet took them down to the damp, moss-smelling cold where kings of winter slept in stone. He could picture Lord Stark's face with shadows laid into it like scars no one could see. He could picture the king trying to cloak grief with a laugh that did not fit here. He did not picture himself in their conversation. He would have been wrong. Robert's steps slowed between statues that wore stone wolves on their heads. He kept quiet after his first gods, Ned. As if his chest had realized its own noise and found it a poor fit for the place. They passed Brandon and Ricard. Robert's lips pressed thin. "They will never stop looking at me," he said, half to the air, and then he stopped before Lyanna and took off his crown. He balanced it in one hand like a thing that pricked. "I brought your daughter to see her," he said softly. "It is not her daughter," Ned said at once and stopped, because correcting names before the dead felt wrong even when he was correcting the king. Robert huffed. "No. But if she had had one." He swallowed and laughed at himself, rough as gravel. "If she had had one, I would have given the world to see her with a child. There is no gentler sight." Ned folded his hands as if in prayer. He had never known what to do with Robert's sadness when it was bare. It always felt like looking at a road that went somewhere he could not follow. "She would have liked the girl," he said. "What else could he offer?" The king nodded. His eyes were bright with drink or something else. "Sweet. She looks at a place as if it will tell her its story if she waits. That one." He jerked his chin vaguely toward the sun that would have been the south if it were above ground. "That one makes me think of what I could have been if I had not been so busy breaking things and calling it rule." Ned said nothing. There were names like milk and names like iron. He tasted both and held his tongue. "I will ask you something," Robert said finally. He turned to face Ned fully and set the crown gently on the cold floor by Lyanna's feet, as if unburdening himself would make his request seem less like a blow. "Not for myself, but for the realm and for her ghost." Sansa to Joffrey, done. "I am not blind to your unease about it. But listen, I want more than a thread between us. I want a rope. Myrcella to your boy." Ned's face changed, and Robert saw it and threw up a hand as if to fend off the words he knew were coming. "Not Robb," the king said quickly. "Not Robb. The other. The quiet one. The one you keep at the edge of your table and never let starve." Ned felt as if the stone had grown colder beneath his boots. He glanced by instinct at Lyanna's statue as if expecting it to lift its stone head. "Jon is a bastard," Robert said. "Yes, a bastard I can wipe clean with a stroke of quill and seal. You know it, Ned. You know I can. I made Gendry nothing and an anvil all in the same breath. This one I will make a Stark. Allô Fulson. Jon Stark wed to my daughter. The North and the crown will be tethered, and when Lannisters and Tyrells and the rest of them look at that tether, they will stop thinking of axes and start thinking of gardens." "You do this," Ned said carefully, "to spite your queen?" Robert's teeth showed in a grin with very little mirth in it. "To spite a spider's nest of cousins and uncles and a father who would sit my crown on his wrist like a bracelet and ask if it suits him. But also because," he gestured around them, abrupt, "because I have no sons worth their meat and my daughter looks at men and sees men, not pieces. She needs a husband who will make his place rather than carve it out of her. That boy, he watches people, Ned. I don't trust men who do not. There is sense in him, and he looks like a Stark. A realm likes to see the North be the North. I will give them that to look at." Ned heard himself breathe. He thought of Catelyn's face. He thought of the iron letter that had been his promise to bury the truth with a name so common it became camouflage. The promise to Lyanna. Blood on her lips, her eyes too bright for fever. "Promise me, Ned." No decision in the world felt as entirely his as the ones he could not make. "Robert," he said, "he is my son. He is your—" He stopped. The words built on themselves the way stone did, deliberate, unpretending, heavy. "If you do this, you must protect him. Not as a toy, not as a jest thrown in Cersei's teeth. You must protect him from the bite that will come." "Bite?" Robert snorted. "You make your wolves too large in your mind, Ned. Wolves know when they are hunted," Ned said, and the king's eyes flicked to the direwolf heads, and the jest died on his lips. "Very well," Robert said after a beat that felt like a held breath. "I will make it more than a betrothal. I will make it marriage as soon as we are in the capital. She is a child. There will be no consummation until she has bled and you approve it. We will give them their vows, give the realm a symbol, and it will be done." No one will gainsay it. Not even Tywin Lannister will cut a knot that has been tied in the Great September." Ned stared at him. He imagined Myrcella's small, earnest face and Jon's guarded eyes. He imagined Catelyn's hands clenching in her skirts. He imagined the North trying to drink this southern wine and choking. "You mean to saddle Jon with a court?" he said softly. "I mean to saddle him with a wife who deserves better than to be used like a game piece and forgotten." Robert replied unexpectedly, and something in his face for a heartbeat looked like the boy he had been. Sincere in the way only boys who have never been thwarted can be. "And I mean to give you a son in the Red Keep who is not a lion." Ned looked at Lyanna and did not ask forgiveness because he did not know if he wanted it. He thought of days chasing through the Wolf's Wood, of snow, of that first tiny mouth at a woman's breast too still to ever smile. He thought of the long brittle line he had walked for years. "I will speak with my lady," he said at last. "You will tell her king has decided," Robert said, but he did not say it like a threat. He reached down and picked up his crown. "Friend, all our choices are teeth now. Better to choose which bite to take." They came up from the crypts to winter sunlight and the smell of stewing onions. Catelyn met Ned's eyes across the yard and knew something had been asked and something had been agreed to. She set her mouth because that was what she could control. She did not shout. She let him tell her the whole of it in their chamber, the heavy fur hangings muting the sound of courtyard life to a hush. She listened with her hands folded so tightly that when she unfolded them later there were half-moons of nail marks in her palms. "Legitimized," she said quietly. "A royal marriage." She had known all her adult life the North demanded a queen out of her. She had not expected to be asked to find grace for this. "He will displace Robb." "No," Ned said. "The king can legitimize, but he cannot reach into a father's will and rearrange his love. Robb is my heir. And Jon." Her eyes were dry and terribly clear. "What is he, if not son, if not heir, if not bastard? What is he, Ned?" "The king's son-in-law," he said, and the words made the room colder. She laughed once. The noise was not kind. "You would put my children's necks within reach of Cersei Lannister." "She is already reaching," Ned said. "This will not pull her hand back, but it might change where it lands." Catelyn turned away. Through the arrow slit, Winterfell's gods would crouched like an old thought. "And the boy?" she asked, and Ned knew which boy she meant before she spoke next. "Jon. Does he want this?" "I do not know," Ned said truthfully. "I think he wants the wall. I think he wants to take vows so large they make the rest of his life small enough to bear. But if the king gives an order, the boy will obey," Catelyn finished, "because he is a good boy." In the quiet that followed, she hated him and loved him and hated herself for both. "Bring him," she said. "Let him stand here and I will tell him I will not stand in the way. I will do that much." Jon came because Lord Stark sent for him. He entered the room with Ghost at his heel and looked at Catelyn first because she had always taught him without words to do that. His eyes told her he understood a blow was coming. He looked like a child who has learned to keep his head steady because it hurts less if you do not flinch. "His Grace," Ned said, and the rest followed like rocks falling. Jon did not speak for a long time. He looked down at his hands, at the scars on his fingers, at a life he had begun to reimagine as black cloth and cold wind. "I gave my word to Benjen," he said at last. "You gave it to yourself," Ned said gently. "There is honor in that. There is also honor in obeying your lord when he asks a heavy thing. This is a king's will. I will not pretend it does not suit the North as well. I will not pretend I am not asking you to leave something behind to pick up something you did not ask for." Jon heard beyond the words because Ned Stark told the truth even when he trimmed it. "You do not want this," he said softly, "but you think it is right." "I think it may be necessary," Ned said. "Right is another thing." Catelyn spoke then, her voice level as a frozen stream. "If this happens, you will be Jon Stark. You will have a place that makes men bow to you in rooms that have never had use for you. You must wear that well and not use it to make me regret agreeing." He returned her gaze and, to her surprise, did not look away. "I have never asked to make you regret less," he said. "I would ask to make you regret more if it meant I could be your son, my lady. But I know what I am, and I will not be your enemy in your own house." The words stole something from her that she had not realized she was holding. A small, hard kernel of grievance that had burned and kept her warm against him. There was no apology in his voice. There was only truth. Catelyn had learned to respect truth even when it cut. She inclined her head. It felt like offering bread to a stranger on a winter road. "It will not be easy," she said. "It has not been easy so far," Jon said simply. "I don't know what else to call a life." Ned put a hand on Jon's shoulder. He felt bones and the set of muscle acquired honestly. He thought of Lyanna. He thought of the old gods whispering through leaves even in winter. "We go south," he said. "We will be careful. We will see what the city makes of us." News moved through Winterfell's stones faster than a man could run. By the time Robert T announced his intention in the Great Hall, half the holdfast had either heard or guessed. When he stood, it was as if a wind entered with him. "My friends of the north," he boomed. "This old stag means to be bound to your house not with one braid but two." The hall laughed dutifully. He lifted his cup toward Sansa. "We have a fair flower for your fair lordling, and we have another little rose for a son of the north carved out of ice and stubbornness. Myrcella to Jon, Jon Stark, by my word." Cersei's smile did not change. It had no need to. It had already been ready for this. She had screamed in private. She had broken a goblet. She had told Jaime he must do something, anything, and had been met by his little shrug. "Brother," she had said like a curse. "Your Grace," Ser Barristan had said in a voice worn smooth by long practice, when the Queen had summoned him solely to watch the knuckles of her hands. "The King may." "I know what the King may do," Cersei had answered. "We shall see what the faith will do. A marriage can be undone if it suits Seven and the law. Until then, we shall smile." She smiled now. Tyrion watched from below and lifted his wine as if to a puppet play he did not like and could not quit. Joffrey looked stupefied, then looked to his mother and found his composure again. Myrcella's hands were folded and very still, and Tommen blinked hard as if it would change the words. Jon stood like a man who had stepped out onto a frozen river and felt the sound of cracking but not yet the cold rush of water. He would remember later the way Arya's face had lit not with delight but excitement. Change, to her, was always a door to be flung open. Sansa had looked at him as if he had stolen something from her without knowing what it was. Robb had clapped him on the shoulder and not let him see the weight in his eyes. Theon had grinned with all his teeth. Ghost had yawned, which Jon found inordinately comforting. They left Winterfell within days, for the road was long and the king's patience short. The queen fretted about weather. The king roared at the sky and the sky ignored him. Jon stood at the back of the royal train with the men of Winterfell. He watched Myrcella ride sometimes at her mother's side, sometimes between two white cloaks like a small bright fish attended by sharks. When she trotted near the rear to see a hawk on a branch or a squirrel whose tail considered itself too grand for the north, she smiled at the guard beside her and thanked him, always, for nothing at all. At a ford where the water came late to its ice and ran clear as glass over brown stones, she slipped her reins and bent to cup the cold and brought it to her lips. Her hand shook. She laughed at herself and bit her bottom lip and looked around to see if anyone had seen. Jon looked away. She saw that he had looked away and, for the first time, met his eyes. She did not duck her head. She nodded as if they had both performed something correct. Later, at a small camp beneath bare alders, while the king drank near the largest fire and the queen's pavilion blinked with candlelight like a jeweled eye, Jon took a bowl of stew and sat where the warmth reached his knees but not his face. He ate fast and honest. He did not expect anyone to come sit near him. When she did it by degrees, hopping from stone to stone of permission in the way careful children do. She came with a serving girl and Lannister guard and a shadow of a king's guard at a distance. "My lord," she said when she was close enough to be heard. Her cheeks were pink with cold. The hood of her mantle had fallen back. Her hair was a paler gold than her mother's, less deliberate, more sunlight than coin. She held her bowl as if it might spill with too much care. I wish to say hello. It seems to me we will never be introduced properly, or we will be introduced in a place so large it will swallow the words. Jon stood at once and bowed a bow that was too deep for who he had been yesterday and perhaps not deep enough for who he would be tomorrow. He could not be sure. Princess, he said. He could not shape her name yet. It felt like touching something delicate that you do not know how to hold. You are welcome to my fire. It is your father's fire, she said with the open correctness of a child taught to know ownership. Then she looked at it as if trying to see whose it was beyond names and decided that was foolish and laughed a little. It is very warm. Ghost came out of the dark like a rumor and sat beside Jon's knee. Myrcella's eyes widened, and her face did something charmingly contradictory. It grew wary, but her hands wanted to reach. She restrained them and looked up at Jon for permission. He will not bite, Jon said. Not unless you ask him to. Her mouth formed a surprised O. Then she smiled, delighted. I do not ask anyone to bite, she said with dignity and reached. Ghost tolerated the hand with the long-suffering patience of a great beast that endures children because they smell like sweetness and do not yet know how to be cruel. Myrcella stroked his ear. He is very soft. He looks softer than he is, Jon said, because truth and jokes often wore the same clothes. And you? She asked, and then blushed because she had not meant to say it aloud. I am softer than I look, Jon answered, and she laughed. A quick, bright sound that made the closest guards shift their weight. When she had eaten 3 bites, she thanked him, which made no sense, and withdrew as carefully as she had approached, as if the space between them were a river crossed by stepping stones and she had memorized their positions. He watched her go. He did not think of love. He thought of carefulness and kindness and the way some people moved through the world as if they expected it to be nearly as good as it could be, which meant they were surprised and hurt often. He felt at once protective and ashamed of feeling protective. He wanted her to learn to see what he saw without learning what he had learned to pay for that seeing. The King's Road stretched south, the ruts iced, the hedges brittle. They passed Wintertown's cottages sunk to their windows in drifts and later smaller villages with fences like ribs. Later still inns that leaned warm light out into the cold and caught a part of them like pitch on the way by. When they reached the Trident, the trees looked like fingers thrust up from earth, black against a pallid sky. Men told the story of Rhaegar dying here and looked at Ned and at the king, and then to Jon because he was watching them, and then away for some stories where their tale-tellers out. At the Crossroads Inn, heat took them by surprise and made the king sweat under his furs. He drank with old fury, glad to find a thing he could do as he had always done it regardless of season. Cersei kept to her rooms. Joffrey strutted and sneered. Sansa gleaned compliments like a patient gleaner after harvest and stacked them neatly in her mind. Arya made a friend in a boy who fought with a broom handle. Robb and Jon traded a look that contained home and the road and the fact that they were leaving one to gain the other. Are you frightened? Robb asked when they shared bread before sleep. Yes, Jon said. Robb nodded as if Jon's fear were a plan he approved of. The South cannot be worse than Theon, he said. Theon is the South, Jon said dryly, and Robb laughed so hard he woke Grey Wind. King's Landing appeared like a bruise on the horizon and resolved itself, as they drew nearer, into walls and domes and roofs jostling like beggars for space and light. The smell wrapped them before the city did. Salt and tar and rot and too many people exhaling the same air. The Red Keep perched on its hill, a red stone hand on the city's throat. Jon had seen castles. He had never seen a city. He distrusted size for its own sake. Size made men confuse it with strength. They processed through the river gate with trumpets and banners and the kind of ceremony that always made Jon feel as if someone had moved the walls of the world closer on all sides. The crowd shouted and hissed in equal measure. Flowers flew, so did a rotten apple. The hound leaned over his saddle, caught the apple in one hand with lazy quickness, and took a bite, to laughter and rough cheer. Within the Red Keep, Lady Sansa found herself floating like a petal in an eddy, and Arya found herself a fish flung out on marble. Catelyn counted exits without moving from any door.
Ned breed shallow.
The king looked at his court as if it were an old injury, a pain he had learned to carry and occasionally to forget. Cersei had not forgotten. If she smiled any harder, her face would have cracked. She handed her daughter to her husband and stood by like a statue of queenliness, the gaze of all eyes sliding off her and back to the king because he was noisier. "Tomorrow," Robert told Ned again. "We do it tomorrow. We give our children their vows and set this straight. I will not be put off." "Your Grace," Pycelle murmured later in the council chamber, thick with the smell of musty vellum, his lips moving in and out of his beard like a mollusk. "There are concerns of propriety. The princess is married, not made a woman," Robert snapped. "There will be no bedding. The faith can hold all the sevens candles it likes and moralize in long words. We will have done a thing the realm will thank me for when it is not too stupid to understand why." In the Hall of Lamps in the Great September of Baelor, beneath the pale faces of stone that looked down with dazed benediction at sins and vows alike, Jon Stark stood with hair pulled back and a doublet more costly than the roof over most men's heads. He had been weighed and scrubbed and reshaped by the city's hands in the hours since he had arrived. He did not recognize himself entirely. He did not require recognition. He required standing steady, and he did that. Myrcella walked to him with her ladies fluttering like moths. When she reached his side, she set her small hand in his because everyone was watching and because he had extended it and because this, like practice, required grace. Her palm was dry and firm. He looked down and saw the child and the girl and the queen she might someday be, all three flickering like three flames in a draft. The High Septon droned. Jon heard Lord Stark's breath and then did not hear it at all because the world had narrowed to the girl's hand in his, and the simple strangeness of vows said aloud in a voice measured by an old man's cadence. The words were not the old god's words. They were the South's words. Jon said them anyway, because the world sometimes asked you to wear another man's hat to keep rain off your face. When it was done, when the seven had been invoked and the wax had dripped and the courtiers had ho-hummed their way toward a new thing to gossip about, Cersei kissed her daughter's brow, and the kiss was all for show. Robert kissed her cheek and his lips trembled a little, shameful, so that he turned it into a rough laugh. "There," he said loudly to whoever would listen. "Now my little girl is a wolf, and I will hear no more of lions trying to teach her to roar." At the feast that followed, Jaime Lannister came up to Jon and regarded him the way a man regards a sword he has not yet decided to respect. "You look very fine," he drawled. "Very southern. Does it itch?" "Yes," Jon said, and the Kingslayer's laugh showed white teeth. "Good," he said and moved on, bored by men who did not flinch. Ser Barristan found Jon later by a pillar where the air was cooler and the music less a torment. The old knight's hair was white as crusted salt and his eyes were kind. "Lord Stark," he said, "if you are to remain in King's Landing, it would please me to find you a place. A sword left on a wall grows rusty. Would you accept a squire's duty in my household? You will be pulled from it by ceremony and courtiers too often, but we will see what can be made of you between demands." "Yes," Jon said, with a sudden lift of gratitude that shook him. "Yes, sir, I would be honored." "You will be worn like a rock by water," Barristan said with a small smile. "We will try to leave a shape behind that is not entirely foolish." Life began to arrange itself around the new edges. Jon rose early and beat the sun, trained in the yard where heat began to settle and stay as if it had bought the place and was difficult to evict. He learned the city's steps, the turnings and courtyards and doors that lied and those that told the truth. He learned men's faces and the faces men made when they lied. He learned where Myrcella liked to stand at the ramparts in the late afternoon when the sea's breath came up like a civilized animal and the gulls wheeled and cried. They spoke occasionally. It never felt like enough to be called friendship and always felt like too much to be called nothing. She asked him what snow really sounded like when it fell thick and whether Winterfell's gods were kinder because they were quiet. He asked her what a September smelled like when full of people and if the city ever stopped humming under the skin. She told him about a storybook with a knight whose oath kept changing shape whenever he thought he had grasped it. He told her about trees that remembered you. They laughed sometimes. Once she cried, very quietly and briefly, When a litter of kittens born in the stables died because the mother had not enough milk, and she brushed her tears away as if they were smudges and told him sternly not to look at her for a little while, please. He did as she asked. Sansa found Jon's elevation a puzzle she could not stop fingering even when it stung. She watched her sister-in-law-to-be and her bastard brother turn into something a bard might put into a song, and could not make herself certain that she approved of the song's meter. Arya found the whole business a story to climb, hand over hand. She sparred with Jon when she could escape. He made sure no one saw them. Catelyn did not come to King's Landing. She stayed because someone must govern Winterfell and because men were less foolish in front of stone and trees that disapproved loudly. She wrote letters to her husband that said little and meant much. She did not write to Jon. She wrote instead to Robb in a hand that grew steadier the more she used it, telling him how to be where he was, how to speak when speaking mattered, how to listen when silence did more work. Jon read those letters when Robb laughed over them or swore and pretended not to care. He learned from them anyway. The city taught its lessons in other ways. In the small council chamber, Ned found resistance everywhere and ease nowhere. Varys smiled and offered help like cobweb, adhesive when you tried to brush it away. Littlefinger smiled and offered help like a door that would open when you tugged and slam on your fingers when you pushed. Renly smiled because he enjoyed his own face. Pycelle wheezed like a bellows pumping nonsense. Jon, as Barristan's squire and a new-made ornament of the realm, learned quickly how many men used eyes that functioned beautifully and still did not see. He fetched water. He fetched messages. He fetched silence when silence was useful. He listened. He became, oddly, less a bastard and more a man whose edges were not the first thing every room noticed. When news came of a boar and a hunt and a wineskin heavy with friendship that had not been watered enough with caution, Jon felt the crack in the ice again beneath his feet. He did not know that he had set himself up for hearing it forever, for that was what living in a city was, a long, careful listening for cracks. They brought the king back on a bier, and his breath came like a foundry bellows near failure. Cersei wept where everyone could see. Joffrey stood very straight. Myrcella's lips trembled, and she bit them and looked to her father and then to Jon. And he stood where she could see him and concentrated on breathing, as if that would keep the world in its current shape. Robert called for Ned. He called for wine, then for less wine. He called Ned back when Ned left. He spoke in bursts. Jon heard later from men who stood close that the king named his friend protector and spoke of sons and the foolishness of boys. Two things were not like the others. Two things would not allow themselves to lie still. On a table, near the bed where the king's chest lifted like a bellows, lay a roll of parchment sealed with the king's signet. On that bed lay a man dying as he had lived, too loudly and too late. Jon did not stand within the chamber. Barristan did. He emerged afterward with a face like weathered stone. "His grace rests," he said, and the court drew in like a tide against a cliff. The rest spun quickly, as quickly as 1,000 small acts of cowardice and courage can be made to seem a single movement when history tells it later. Cersei took power in her hands with the gentle, inexorable confidence of a woman who had learned the shape of every door in this castle and where to press. The small council met with a great deal of sounding. Renly vanished, offended and afraid in equal measure. Stannis was absent and loomed. Joffrey ascended in waiting as if waiting were an action. Eddard Stark made one mistake. He tried to put truth on the table and ask men to eat. He had not lived long enough in the South to remember men often preferred sweet lies to bread. He trusted honor in a hall where honor had been picked clean and hung up for show. Janos Slynt sold him for a title and a bigger house. Peter Baelish put a knife in his throat using only a handful of words. The gold cloaks changed color. Barristan put his hand on his sword and then took it off again when his oath, pounded on an anvil 30 years long, rang wrong if he struck with it. Jon did not know any of this was happening until he knew all of it was happening. He ran toward the noise with the rest of the world and found the world already small and contained by steel. He was pressed to a wall while men he had learned to greet took his lord father and turned him into a traitor by the simple act of pointing spears. He could not get to Ned. He could not get to Cersei. He could not get to anyone but Myrcella because Myrcella had stepped wrong, had slipped the net of hands for one blink to look for him. In that blink, he reached her. "Don't," he said, because her mouth had made a shape that meant calling Joffrey, and he did not know what would come out if she called him, and he did not wish to know. He led her to a side door. He had learned all the doors. He found a passage that Varys had smiled at him once for knowing. He found a door where the hinges did not cry. He did not know where he was going. He knew where he was not staying, and sometimes that was enough. She came because he took her hand and because he said her name the way you say names in God's woods, with respect and reluctance and fear that you will wake something too large. "Where?" she asked when breath allowed. "Out," he said. "Up." They went down and then up and then out because that was the shape of escape here. At the end of a long climb, air hit them like a slap. They ran along the ramparts while below the city learned a new king. At a sally port, he used a key he should not have had and did not ask himself why he had it. Ghost appeared like an old certainty, red eyes hot in the shade, and brushed his legs as if to say, "Do not forget me in your human foolishness." "Myrcella," Jon said, and tasted the stress-sweet salt of her name. "Princess, wife, you must choose now what is to be done with you." She looked at him with the child girl queen face and felt, perhaps for the first time, the edges of the world without a mother's hand. Between her and the frame, he expected tears. She did not give them. She nodded once. "Find Uncle Tyrion," she said sensibly. "He will not sell me." Then she shook her head at her own words, learning herself as she spoke. "He will sell me, but at a price that includes me alive." Jon almost laughed, shocked by relief. "We cannot find him here. He is not here." "Then we must find someone who wants me alive," she said, and that, at least, was not hard. Varys found them. He found everyone. He materialized from Shadow like someone who had taught Shadow how to behave. "My lord, my lady," he said, bowing. "Forgive the imposition, but the city has become unfriendly for wolves who are not on leashes. If you wish to continue barking, perhaps another kennel would do." "Winterfell," Jon said, which was the truest word he knew. "Or White Harbor." "White Harbor," Varys agreed, as if he had wanted Jon to say it. "A friend of your house sits there with his large belly and his larger patience. He will feed you and clothe you and send polite letters to all the men in this city who imagine they can decide your shapes. May I?" He held out a packet of clothes with an apologetic flourish. "Disguises are always an offense to good taste, but a help to survival." "I will not," Myrcella began, which was precisely the moment to make concessions. And then she closed her mouth and took the poor wool and the cap and put them on as if they were steps to climb a tower. She handed Jon a pair of rough-spun breeches he did not need and a tunic that fit a lower version of himself he had once been. They went with Varys through a door that was supposed to be a wall and a wall that was supposed to be a door and came out where the city's smell hit harder with fish and tar and human closeness. At the river, among boats that were walkways and houses and livelihoods, they found Davos Seaworth, because Varys's hands had always been good at plucking one thread from a cloth. Davos had onions in the name men gave him and long practice at getting past things that wanted to stop him. He looked at Jon with one eye that had learned to tell men from trouble and to assume both. He looked at Myrcella and saw a girl with her hair darkened by cheap dye and her chin lifted. "You'll take them," Varys said with bland confidence. "I will," Davos said, not because of Varys but despite him. He put them in a skiff to take them to a larger boat that smelled like salt and old planks. He handed Jon a coil of rope because it is always best to make a man useful. He nodded at Myrcella. "And you? I can hold a rope," she said affronted. "Good," he said. "Hold this one and don't let go until I say." She held it until the skin of her palms burned and never whimpered. Davos nodded to himself in the way of a man who had already decided something and was glad he had been proved right. They slipped down the Blackwater like a thought made of water and woke into salt and wind. The city shrank until it was a smear, then a line, then nothing but a notion they carried because the world likes to follow you when you flee it. Jon stood at the stern and watched gulls that had learned to live on the edges of men's mess. Myrcella sat wrapped in a blanket and did not become smaller with the sea. Tommen would have been sick. Joffrey would have shouted. Myrcella learned the role and kept her dignity. At night, she slept like a child because she was one. Jon slept like a man with one hand on a wolf who could not follow him everywhere. He dreamed of snow falling into a southern sea and melting before it touched. White Harbor received them with the politeness of wealth and the warmth of men who had eaten well most of their lives and did not hold it against the world. Lord Wyman Manderley made his courtesies and his jokes. He was a man who understood that humor softened fear and made men brave when they thought they were merely amused. He put Myrcella in a chamber with good light. He put Jon in a chamber next to it and a guard outside, both who knew the names of everyone's grandfather back to the conquest. Letters went south with his seals and his careful hand. Letters went north to Maester Luwin and to Robb because Jon wrote them and Wyman sent them without asking to read. "We must think how we mean to be cunning," Lord Manderley said more than once, as if cunning were a thing like salt that could be measured and poured. "We must not merely be righteous. Righteousness tastes better baked in cunning's crust." Jon discovered a smallness in himself that made sense again. Simple tasks, honest days. He went to the wolf's den and saw the statue of the old knight whose name it was and who had once fed men when the sea and war had tried to starve them. He liked the smell of fish more than the smell of king. He took Myrcella to the quays at dusk and watched the fishwives scold their lads and the men haul nets, and somewhere in her eyes the city's noise became not all the world. Word finally reached them, borne by raven and then by man, words not stable enough to hold in ink alone. The king in the north, the men shouted beneath the windows of White Harbor when wine and loyalty ran hot. Robb Stark, king in the north.
Ned Stark, traitor. Ned Stark, dead.
The last word was a blade thrown into a room. Jon had known it was coming the way you know where a knife will land before you see it thrown. It still pinned him in place when it hit. He did not make a sound. He went to the sea and stood in its wind and felt everything within him find a shape that would hold and then crack and then hold again. Myrcella came and stood at his side. She did not take his hand. She did not speak. He loved her for that. He thought the word and was shocked by it. He set it aside to laugh at later, a small mad laugh that would make him feel better for a heartbeat. He did not laugh now. "You are alone," he said eventually. "So are you," she answered. "No," he said, and the salt on his cheeks was not the sea.
"No.
I am a Stark. I am a man in a house where men take each other's grief and make it less heavy by carrying it between them." He looked at her. "And you are my wife, so you are not alone either." She nodded. He saw a girl and a queen both bow their heads. Roose Bolton came with men who smelled of cold iron and whose eyes measured all things and found them frivolous. He came to White Harbor because the king in the north was calling banners at Riverrun and because every road south ran through decisions. His gaze slid over Myrcella and lodged on Jon as if finding a thorn he must consider. "Your marriage is an impediment," he said to Jon the way one speaks to a man about a broken cartwheel. "To what?" Jon asked mildly. "To set mouths from the trident to the neck cawing," Roose said. "Your legitimacy bends old lines. Some men like bent lines. Some do not." "Do you?" Jon asked him. "I like roads that are clear of bodies," Roose said. "Your wife is a Lannister." "She is Myrcella," Jon said, and Roose's pale eyes did something that might have been amusement if they had believed in such a thing. "She is also useful," Roose allowed. "We may have to make use of her. We will not trade her for our convenience," Jon said. Roose's mouth did not move and somehow still smirked. "I did not suggest you would," Roose said. "I suggested that the road will ask it of you." He bowed and left them with the smell of something that had lived too long in shade. Robb came, dear as a lost thing found, and not the boy who had said the South could not be worse than Theon, but a king with a line in his brow where he had been forced to make decisions faster than wisdom grows. He embraced Jon and they stood a moment, shoulder to shoulder, boys who had run together, men learning together how to stand. Robb greeted Myrcella with courtesy and a public smile that was almost kind. In private, he held his temper like a sword and spoke carefully around the girl, who wore his enemy's face without having asked for it. "She is innocent," Jon said when they were alone. "Innocent people die in the south," Robb said. "They die in the north too," Jon said. "We forgive our cold quicker than we forgive their heat." Robb sat and put his head in his hands for a moment and then lifted it with a small, sick grin. "You sound like a maester," he said. "Gods, Jon. I wish Father were here to tell us we are being idiots." "He would," Jon said. They laughed until one of them made a sound that was not laughter, and they stopped. They went to war not because they wanted to, but because war had come to them. Jon did not go to battle straight away. Robb sent him to the Karstarks and Umbers and Manderleys with letters in which a bastard's handwriting had softened some of the anger of a king's commands. He carried Myrcella's safety like a second sword. He learned to treat men with casseroles of pride and injury the way Lord Wyman treated fish, with salt and thyme. Catelyn came to White Harbor once, on her way south. She looked at Myrcella and saw a child and a queen both and bowed to both because courtesy costs less than war. When she was alone with Jon, she held his face in her hands for the first time in his life. "You must not die," she said in a voice that had been scraped raw. "You must not add to my dead." "I have never done anything you asked of me simply because you asked," he said gently. "But I will do this. I will not die if I can help it." She kissed his brow as if she had found that stone inside him again and was trying one last time to make it soft. "Be less noble than your father," she said hoarsely. "Live long enough to be wrong. Live long enough to be right again." When she had gone, Myrcella asked Jon what his mother had asked of him. He told her. She nodded as if it made sense. "She is wise," she said. "Sometimes wisdom is just wanting to keep what you have." "Sometimes," Jon said. "Sometimes it is letting it go." They set out at last because the north does not sit still when called. They moved south in a column of gray and blue and white, banners snapping in clean cold. Myrcella rode in a litter when the roads were bad and on a palfrey when the roads were better. She learned to play her part, showing herself to small folk who craned to see and who did not throw rotten apples. She smiled at them and waved small gloved hands, and they warmed to her because children are forgiven their fathers' debts longer than men are. She gave coins quietly to women who looked as if the world had taken something from them and forgotten to return it. At Moat Cailin, perched above the shabby, drowned choke point of the realm, they waited and counted ravens. Tyrion's letter came first. Alive, he said, with a wit sharpened into a knife. He had been made hand to Joffrey by a father who sent him to do what he did not wish to do himself. He told Jon that Cersei made talk of annulments and petitions to the faith, but that the High Septon, ensconced in his creams and wrinkled dignity, had decided the King's Act was the Seven's will until it was not. He offered advice in the tone of a friend and bait in the tone of a man accustomed to fishing in troubled waters. He asked after Myrcella with a heaviness under the words that surprised Jon whenever he forgot that love came where it chose. Stannis's letter came next, stern as a wall. He named Cersei's children monsters and named himself king and asked the North to bend. He offered justice the way men offer a spoon of bitter medicine. He did not mention Myrcella except to say she should be put aside as unclean. Jon read the paper and felt something old and hard balk. He did not show Myrcella the letter. She had learned what she needed to learn. He took it to Robb. Robb burned it whole and did not speak while it burned. Another letter came from a man Jon had expected and had not, Ser Barristan. The old knight's hand shook a little in the curves of his writing. He wrote from exile. Joffrey had dismissed him from the Kingsguard with a smile that had showed all his mother's teeth. "I cannot come to you," he wrote, "and I am not certain whether I should if I could. A vow is a thing that keeps its shape even when it has been broken by others. But I will tell you what I can. There are men in that city who will not harm your lady wife if they can avoid it, not because of you but because of their own honor, which sometimes serves other men's purposes better than their own. The rest of them will do what is useful. Keep out of usefulness." Jon laughed at the last and put the letter away like a small shield he could hold under his cloak. They moved. War is movement and waiting and stink and brief shattering brightness like a hammer against iron. Jon learned to kill and to see what he had done. He learned that arrows do not care whose son you are. He learned the sound men make when they are afraid and pretend they are not. He learned the expression Roose Bolton wore when he was pleased, which was an absence. He learned the way Lord Karstark hated anyone who smiled near him while he boiled his grief down to vengeance. He learned that Great Jon Umber's shout was like hearing a storm decide it had a favorite tree. He fought at the Whispering with less by luck than intent. Robb's intent, which was good enough, and Jon's, which was careful. He took a night's surrender and felt like vomiting afterward because the man's mouth had been full of blood and courtesy at the same time. He helped round up prisoners while Great Jon roared and wolves bayed and men slapped backs and forgot whose backs were worth slapping. When they found Jaime Lannister under a pile of men and dead horses, Jon stood to one side and watched the world change shape again in the space of a heartbeat. Jaime looked at him and saw a boy he had mocked in a Red Flag Hall. Jon looked at him and saw a man who had smiled while he cut down those in his path. He was not surprised when Robb put Jaime in chains. He was surprised when he felt, for a breath, the urge to cut the king's enemy's bonds and hand him a sword simply to see what would happen. He told no one that. Some thoughts you speak and they grow teeth. Myrcella came to the sick tents, clean as a candle amidst grime. She brought broth and held cups and learned to tear bandages along the grain. Some men refused help until they realized who she was and then refused more firmly. Some softened. She would leave a tent and find a corner and breathe as if she were trying not to be sick. Jon found her there once and stood near with both them looking at a patch of earth. "I will not break," she said. "You will not," he agreed, and that was all. The riverlands burned black and green under the sun. Walder Frey's bridge stood like a sneer across the water. Myrcella met the Fry girls and found them all desperately ready to be chosen. She smiled as if choosing were a pleasure and not a duty. Jon stood at her shoulder and kept his face smooth. He did not trust the old man's watery eyes or the way sons and bastards and grandsons thronged him like flies to honey left in a warm kitchen. He trusted even less the calculations he saw moving behind those eyes when they rested on Myrcella. "Your wife is valuable," Roose said mildly afterward. "Many men will gauge your price by her." "She is priceless," Jon said. "Exactly," Roose murmured. "And a man with something priceless is in danger not because men covet it, but because they will decide to teach him that prices always exist." When the raven came with black thread coiled under words like a snare, Jon felt again the old crack in ice, louder now, a groan that told you river and riverbed were about to part. Tywin Lannister moved. The South gathered around him like dry grass around a match. In King's Landing, Tyrion wrote in a desperate hand that the city had become a mouth waiting for food, and that Cersei had found ways to turn Myrcella's marriage into a theme in a song of her injury that made men cry who should have known better. "Joffrey will do something stupid," Tyrion wrote. "I would prefer he not do it with your wife's neck in sight of the September." Jon did not need Tyrion's letter to fear that. Myrcella had learned to sleep with a knife under her pillow because it made her feel less small even if it made no real difference. He had taught her to hold it. He had taught her also where to throw it if she could not hold it. He slept poorly and woke ready to move on air. Robb had decisions to make. He made them. He made them with men who had opinions that carried spears behind them. He made them with a mother whose counsel had become sharp and sorrowful like winter sunlight. He made them with a best friend who had become a Lord Paramount's hostage. He made them with Jon, who had become brother and counsel both. One of those decisions carried them into the twins under the promise of salt and bread and the sloppy, oily kindness of Walder Frey, and into a hall that smelled of onions and suspicion. Another carried Catelyn south somewhere Robb could not see her and back again with a tale in her eyes that made the king in the north older by 10 years in a night. In White Harbor, Lord Wyman kept ships fueled as if prayer could be fed into oars. He fed Myrcella letters like bread and told her to eat slow so it would last. He looked at Jon and said, "We are between teeth still. Make your wife's name more useful to our teeth than to theirs." "Is that how you say, 'I am glad you are alive in this city'?" she asked one day when he returned from council and leaned his forehead against the cool stone of her chamber for a long count of 20. Yes, he said, breathing. Sometimes it is the only way that works. They built something in the pauses between war. It was not the shape of a marriage anyone had sung about, but it was real. He told her things in pieces as if he were taking stones out of a river one by one. She listened and put them in stacks and did not try to cross until he said it was safe. She told him about a mother who had taught her sweetness like a courtyard teaches a bird to fly, by cutting off all exits. He told her about an aunt whose last word had eaten his life. He did not tell her the word. Not then. When at last he did, it was because the world had shifted again and the crack had opened and he had fallen not into cold water but into the knowledge that he could not protect what he loved by telling less truth than he could bear. It was a night when the wind off the sea sounded like ghosts in a stairwell. He told her the rumor that had become fact for him, that he was not Ned Stark's son but his sister's, that his father had been a man who had played a harp on a riverbank and died on that same river with rubies rolling like blood in the mud. He told her the law and the blot and the reason men would kill him for it if it were loud enough to hear. She sat very still. She did not say the words queen or throne. She did not try to fit him into a story she had been told. "You are John," she said simply when he had finished. "When I look for you, I find you where I left you." He felt something inside him that had never had a shape before. Take one and then rest. "If those names come looking for me," he said, "I will not go with them. If they come looking for you," she said with a small, fierce light in her eyes he had learned to trust like a lamp in fog, "they will have to get past me. I find that comforting for myself and alarming for them." He laughed into her hair and felt the world become bearable briefly, which is perhaps all a world can be asked for. When the letters stopped for a time, when ravens came with soot in their feathers and silence instead of news, the North learned what silence can mean. The twins taught their lesson. Men did not sp a K of salt or bread afterward without tasting blood. Rob's crown lay somewhere men could not find. Catelyn's voice, when it returned, was not the voice of a woman who had room left in her for words. Jon stood under Winterfell's gates when at last he came home with the remnants of an army that was no longer an army but a flock of men who had lost their shepherd and would bite if you tried to herd them. He stood with Myrcella on a horse behind him because they had chosen to come north after all, because south had become too full of ghosts that wore their faces and their enemies' faces both. He looked up at the battlements and saw men whose eyes had learned to expect betrayal, and he felt the shape of his wife at his back like the certainty of the ground. "Jon," someone called from the wall, voice breaking on the stone like a second puberty. "Bran?" No, Bran was not there. Bran was a story now that moved through the north with strange feet. It was a boy of the garrison whose name Jon did not know and might one day. The gate creaked. Winterfell breathed out. Catelyn descended the steps with her hair coming free in the wind. She took Myrcella's face in her hands as if she were inspecting a child for fever. She looked into her eyes and saw there the girl and the queen and something that had grown in the march from south to north. Stubbornness or simply the belief that one could take shape and keep it. She nodded. She turned and took Jon's head into her hands and pressed her mouth to his brow and kept it there a long time, as if she could press sense or strength or simple stubborn survival into him and seal it. "This is not over," she said when she let him go. "Nothing is ever over," Jon said. "It only changes names." They began again. Winterfell took them, stern and forgiving in the way of old houses that cannot afford to remember each slight every day. Myrcella learned to walk the godswood without shoes and not be afraid of silence so large it contains you. She sat with Maester Luwin and learned sums. She listened to the howling of the direwolves and did not mistake it for threat. The North watched her the way a village watches a stranger who moves in and starts sweeping their door stoop every morning. Wary, then wry, then loyal if the stranger keeps sweeping. When the wall sent word of shadows moving in snow larger than men and of wildlings stirred up like leaves by a gale, the North did what it always does. It remembered that enemies do not always wear banners. Men looked at Jon differently then. They looked at his name and the way it had been changed by a king's whim and by a secret not yet known by anyone who does not matter. They looked at Myrcella and saw a southern crown that did not glitter here and a girl who had learned to tie her own cloak. They weighed these things and found, for a time, that the scale balanced. They would weigh them again later. That was only human. On a morning that broke hard and blue, when the air snapped in the nose, Jon found Myrcella at the Godswood's heart beneath the weirwood's face. The red sap scar down the white trunk looked like an old wound freshly opened by winter. She had gone barefoot into the snow and did not seem to feel it. "You will get sick," he said. It was a thing to say because the other thing to say had teeth. "It hurts less," she said, wiggling her toes so the snow creaked. "When I am thinking too many things I come here and think only about how cold my feet are." "What are you thinking?" he asked. "About what kind of queen I would be if there were thrones for people like me to sit on," she said with candor he loved and hated. "About what kind of queen I could be if I sat on no throne." "You mean to be queen of the north through me?" he teased gently, because teasing made hard bread softer. She shook her head. "No. I mean to be queen of small things. The kitchen pots, the schedules of winter stores, the way old men are listened to when they say what they know, the way girls are taught to hide knives in their hair and boys to admit they are afraid when the snow is too heavy. Those are thrones that do not show as much. They topple less often. They carry more." He thought of her with a ledger and a knife and a laugh and felt the world assemble itself around a signpost that did not point to war. He reached for her hand. She let him take it. His fingers were warm and hers cold. He found he liked the exchange. "We will live," he said into the bark silence. "We will live long enough to get old and wrong and right again. We will live long enough for men to call us foolish and then wise for the same thing with a different name. And we will teach the North to forgive the South," she said. "And teach the South that the North's forgiveness is a dear thing not to be spent all at once," he replied. They stood there until breath turned to fog and the cold did what cold does, made important what is warm. When at last they went in, the house smelled of bread and would smoke and iron. The sense that say a place has decided not to die today. Catelyn met them in the passage with a roll of parchment in her hand and a look that made Jon's stomach realize it had learned how to fall in the years since he had left it in boyhood behind. "What?" he asked, because he had also learned to ask rather than simply flee. "Stannis Baratheon has crossed swords with my sister's husband at sea and not drowned in the attempt," Catelyn said, and a corner of her mouth lifted without becoming a smile. "He sends a letter to ask the North to remember that justice is not a southern thing. He names you an affront and demands your wife be sent to the rock that she may be punished appropriately for her mother's sins." Myrcella's small fingers tightened in Jon's but did not shake. "Does he?" she said mildly, as if inquiring about the weather. Catelyn held the letter between thumb and forefinger as if it were something that might stain. "He does," she said. "He is Stannis. What is appropriate punishment for my mother's sins?" Myrcella asked Jon, still in that same mild tone. "Living better," Jon said. Catelyn snorted a laugh that startled them all. It sounded like sudden, rough joy and made the air warmer. "Send him that," she told Jon. "Send Stannis Baratheon the idea that living better is a punishment. See if his face cracks." Jon took the letter into his own hands and read the words the way a swordsman inspects a blade made by another man. Testing notches, weighing balance. He had no crown. He had been made and unmade by a crown more than once already. He had a wife whose feet were cold and whose hands were steady. He had a house that had survived worse men than any presently alive. He had a North that had gone to war and learned its appetite and learned it could break itself when it ate too much. He sat and took up a pen. His handwriting, neat and unlovely, marched across the page. He wrote to Stannis and did not apologize. He wrote to Tyrion and did not ask pardon. He wrote to Davos and asked for fish when fish ran low. He wrote to Barristan and asked for news of men he would not see again. He wrote to the Wall and said he had not forgotten. He wrote to White Harbor and thanked Wyman Manderley for teaching him to eat slowly when the table was set richly because winter always comes for the second course. He spoke after to the hall because Winterfell required words sometimes as much as meat. He told them what came, what would be asked, what could be spared. He did not say king because the word had broken once too many times in their mouths. He said duty and mercy and hunger and patience. He said Myrcella's name and did not say Lannister. He said Stark and did not say it loudly. He said winter and did not make it sound like doom. The North listened. It would listen again. It would disagree. It would obey when obedience proved sensible and break into pieces when the world asked it to be a thing too small for itself. Jon had been taught by a city that names are doors. He had learned by a house that doors are also walls. He would open and shut and open again. He would keep Myrcella safe, not like a jewel in a coffer, but like a blade near the hearth. Within reach, tempered, useful, cherished. That night, late, when even the shadows had grown tired of their own weight, he woke to find her standing by the window with her hair unbound, the moon laying a pale hand on it until it looked like linen spread to dry. The world came in through the opening and lay down on the floor and did not ask permission. He went to her and stood beside her without speaking. "If we had children," she said quietly, "what would they be called?" He did not say kings. He did not say queens. He thought of a boy with dark hair who learned to be quiet before he learned to speak, of a girl who learned sums and the weight of a ledger before she learned to dance. He thought of a child who counted knives and a child who counted loaves, and of one who counted stories. "They would be called ours," he said. "The rest of it will change every year, and we will teach them to change with it without losing themselves." She nodded. He felt her lean against him in that small, trustful way. He knew then with a certainty cold and clean as winter air that if the world came for them, there would be two of them standing, and one would have learned to hold a rope without letting go and the other to stand on a wall and not flinch when men threw rotten apples because they could not reach higher. "Tomorrow," she said. "Yes," he said, and found that the fear that had been a tenant in his chest for so long had finally learned its landlord and agreed to pay rent. In the morning, the guards on the walls said the air smelled of snow. Men went to the stores with lists and women to the counting rooms with chalk on their fingers and boys to the kennels to learn the ways of hounds that have lived longer than they have been alive. A raven landed on a patch of ice with a clatter of black wings and pecked at nothing. The world sprawled in all directions beyond the walls. Somewhere south, a boy king slept badly. Somewhere east, an old knight kept his vows because he had no other clothes to wear. Somewhere on the wall, a horn blew once, twice, and men lifted their heads because once is for rangers returning and twice is for wildlings and three is for things they do not put names to unless they must. Jon counted to 2 with his breath and then to 3 and found that he did not yet have to say the word. He put on his cloak. He went down into the hall that kept its own weather of warmth and noise. Myrcella followed, her hair braided simply, her hands bare. They took their places not on thrones but on benches polished by men and women who had sat through storms before them. When the doors opened to let trouble in, as doors must, the wind sharpened and then settled. The look on the face of the man who entered told them many things, none of them final. Jon stood and Myrcella did not. She remained where she was, grounded like a stone you build on. He thought, as he had thought at the first, that nothing had changed. He knew, as he had learned, that everything had. "We are here," he said to the room and to the man and to winter and to all the names of the realm. "Speak." So the world did. It always had. He listened and measured and replied and built. Not a crown, not a song, but a house where men and women could stand when the wind rose. He had a wife who knew the names of the kitchen pots and the rhythm of a city's heart and the hush of a god's wood. He had a north that was proud and angry and endlessly capable of forgiveness when given something worth forgiving for. He had Ghost, who did not care about human arrangements and would follow his man into any dark. He had learned to live in the space between the crack in the ice and the moment it breaks. In that space, a man can carve a life. In that space, a girl can become a queen of small and necessary things. In that space, a marriage made for reasons too large to be personal can become a home. Snow began to fall. The flakes were small and dry, clicking softly against the stone like hushed applause. Myrcella glanced up once to see it, smiled to herself, and returned to the ledger before her. Jon wrote his own list. He looked at the doors and waited for them to open again, the way doors always do, and felt no panic. There was much to do. The world would always insist upon itself. They would insist back. He called for bread to be brought. He called for a map. He called for names. When the hall filled with the bustle of people doing what people do when they mean to keep one another alive, Jon turned slightly and felt Myrcella's hand on his for the briefest moment. A touch that said we have chosen and will choose again, that said a throne can be two chairs side by side in a cold hall, a ledger shared and a knife polished, a winter faced together. The touch went away. Its warmth remained. Outside, winter announced itself with no song but its own. Inside, a wolf and a princess built their answers, one practical act at a time.